over the last few years, we've been organizing, together with the Indonesian Press Council, the Bali Media Forum, which brings together journalists, editors, journalism trainers, and most importantly, representatives of independent press councils in Asia, to talk about different issues that are facing them, always around promoting ethical journalism and quality in journalism. And last year, which was the 5th Bali Media Forum, we focused on, within the context of covering elections and the particular role that press councils can play in terms of trying to uphold quality and kind of mitigate potential problems, was the issue which is one of the issues that you're looking at the conference, which is hate speech. And we had, different speakers at the Bali Media Forum trying to kind of come to grips with what can press councils specifically do to support ethical journalism and to help journalists and media organizations to confront and to combat hate speech, given that it's a complicated issue. So one of the things, we've come up with a bit of advice and different examples, and what normally happens is that each of the organizations that attend the Bali Media Forum, and we have on average about 55 participants from 25 to 30 countries, they take this home and they then work on this within their own institutions. So for instance, the Indonesian Press Council has been trying to define a bit of extremist speech in what they call cyberspace, so internet and so on. So they've taken the discussions that we had at the Bali Media Forum, and that informed the guidelines that they have published in advance of the elections this year on extremist speech online. So that's kind of like the kinds of things that we're trying to push with this Bali Media Forum.
Could you tell us a little bit about the UN and how freedom of expression is defined in the UN?
And the issue of hate speech and that as well, yeah. Well, as you probably know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19, is a pretty all-encompassing definition of the right to freely receive, impart, share information, and the freedom of expression. So that is one of the key rights that is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, hate speech, as such, is not defined in international covenants or agreements. And it's not mentioned in the International Declaration of Human Rights. It is referred to in the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. And there, what it says is, quite interestingly, it says that states, or member states, countries, not only are permitted, but they are required to pass some type of legislation that prohibits hate speech. But that's all it says. It doesn't say what they mean by hate speech, and they don't actually how exactly each member state should be doing that. As a result, member states have found many different ways of doing this, and there are arguments over how that is done. What is recognized, and that's quite interesting with like recent debates, what is recognized in international law is the incitement to genocide, very specifically. So when you speech, as a result of your speech, a group for their religious, racial, whatever, is being directly persecuted on a genocidal scale. Now this comes from the Nuremberg trials. This is the first time it was introduced. The dreaded Julius Streicher, who was the editor of the horrible Nazi newspaper called Der Stürmer, was the first person to be convicted under this, and rightly so. And then it was actually used for many, many years, and it came up again after the genocide in Rwanda. And several of the people who, I think there was the founder and the editor, I'm not quite sure now, anyways, who were involved in Radio Milkolin, which was, as you probably know, one of the radios that called for people to go out and murder Tutsis and told them where to find them and so on. They were sentenced under this, using this particular law. So that very narrow definition, where my speech pretty much with a direct consequence, it might not be immediate, but it could a direct consequence, a group, a minority group, or is being murdered, then international law comes into place. Most hate speech horrible as it is, doesn't quite reach that level. And so then it's always a question of how the individual countries deal with it. And they deal with it in many different ways. There is also the Convention for the Elimination of Racism and racial discrimination, so it's particularly on racism, which does say that there should be legislation against racist speech. And there have been cases and there have been arguments over that. And generally, I mean, you have, on the one hand, you have the interpretation that the United States of America has found, which is to say, when in doubt, we err on the side of freedom of expression. So they have, as a member state, you can put what is called reservations to some of these articles, and you can kind of tell the UN that you intend to interpret this in a particular way. And most of the Western democracies have registered a concern on that particular issue and said, well, we will try to interpret this more within the context of freedom of expression. The point being that freedom of expression, as it is protected by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, includes the right to offend, disturb, etc. So there could be all kinds of speech that some people would find hateful, but that should be protected under freedom of expression as opposed to incitement to genocide. As a result of all of this, you've had cases. The UN doesn't really deal with it because the UN says it's the member states. But you have examples, for instance, of intergovernmental institutions like the European Court for Human Rights, which has heard cases on this issue. There's one example which I think illustrates this problem quite well. There was a Danish journalist who was convicted in Denmark with reference to the Convention for the Elimination of Racism for a television program that he did, in which he had young kind of skinhead racist youths discussing and talking to them. And so they were saying all kinds of racist messages. And so when that happened, he then went to the European Court of Human Rights. And the European Court of Human Rights, I think rightly, said, you have to see this in context. The broadcast was not made to promote what these young people were saying. On the contrary, the broadcast was made to analyze and provide context, and actually, was negative in the sense of how it portrayed these messages. So, because what they were saying, if you don't let journalists speak with people who have hateful views and report on this in some kind of context, then you curb the debate at a level where it's going to be harmful, even for the intention that you may have in protecting minorities and so on and so forth. That was the interpretation that the European Court of Human Rights did. And then 10 years ago or so, the United Nations, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the Organization of American States, they all have, and so do the African Union, special rapporteurs on freedom of expression. And these people got together and they came up with 5 simple points of what their view is on how you strike this balance between freedom of expression and hate speech. And those might be worse because it's short to just say what they are. Right? What they said is, no one should be penalized for statements which are true. So they may be hateful, but if they're true, they're true. No one should be penalized for the dissemination of hate speech unless it has been shown that they did so with the intention of inciting discrimination, hostility, or violence. This means you have malicious intent. Or are you doing this to analyze, to debate, to discuss, to confront, to demonize even people who come with these messages? It is the right of journalists to decide how best to communicate information and ideas to the public should be respected, and it should, particularly when they are reporting on racism and intolerance. So what these freedom of expression rapporteurs are saying, try and leave this with the professionals as much as you can. No one should be subject to prior censorship. So even if you fall foul of all the things that I've just said, if at all, you get tried after you publish if you break the law, but you do not get kept from publishing in advance. But they recognize that there's a limit to this, and they try to give some guidance of how this can be dealt with. That's what they're trying to do there. obviously it's case by case. And I think most of the journalistic community, as a position internationally and pretty much anywhere, is to try and avoid trying to legislate, certainly at an international level, about this, because there's too many possible cases that can come up. And unfortunately, while, yes, it is true, you have examples of all kinds of hateful speech and straight out hate speech, you also have a lot of examples of where laws are being used to restrict free expression and restrict criticism and restrict particularly minorities and so on, all under the guise of either blasphemy laws or hate speech laws and so on. So when you're trying to strike that balance, what these guys are saying is basically try and protect freedom of expression first, because if you don't, it's more problematic.
So with regards to how journalists can respond to hate speech,
yeah.
and should they report it? If so, then should they quote words of hate speech? How can they do it in a responsible manner?
Yeah.
Well, how can they expose incitement to violence by an extremist or fundamentalist group in a manner that's sensible?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, as I said, there's a difference between incitement to violence, never mind now the genocide issue, just straight incitement to violence and hate speech. These may be the same in some cases, but incitement to violence is something quite specific, because it does call on people to do something against another group. That, I think, for journalists is the first thing really is always context. It's like, so you got to look at like who's saying this. If it's incitement to violence, it obviously is a malicious intent. So you already got that one covered. But there may be, you need to look then in what context, political, particular situation, am I reporting this? So by reporting this, will I inadvertently, even if I'm exposing it, inadvertently promote what these people are saying just because I'm, throwing oil on fire. There's already something going on and I come out with this even though it's important and so on. So you kind of got to balance these things. It's quite important to judge the impact of what you do. If it is about exposing, then you might decide that, say there's already some, some riot going on or something, and some person comes out and says something horrible about a group and calls on them to, his group to attack the other group or whatever. If there's already something happening, you might not, do this verbatim. You might say that the leader of Group X has also come out and it's pouring oil on the fire and is trying to stoke violence, and then try and come up with context and information that puts this hopefully a bit more on an even keel. I think it's also quite important, just because somebody says something horrible and outrageous doesn't make it news. It is really very much who's saying this, on behalf of whom are they speaking, what are their interests, and of course if a powerful person, say a candidate in an election with a chance of getting somewhere, not somebody with 3 votes, is saying something like that, then I would always say, yes, it is worth reporting. And if you do it well, and if you're allowed to do it well, you put it in a context. Very often you see, I think some journalists have found really smart ways of doing this without, saying, here is what this person is going to say and it's horrible, which doesn't really help. And the people who might want to listen to this will then immediately side with that person. And sometimes it's much better to just say, all right, this is what, whatever Mr. or Mrs. X has to say about this, and then give some information. So they say, the UK context, Bulgarian immigrants are taking all our jobs. And then the next thing is, in the last month, we've had 3 Bulgarian immigrants or something like that. And then without actually making, viewers and readers and listeners are not stupid, they'll make the link. And that, I think, is quite important. So what it comes down to very often is really, in the newsroom, how much confidence, how much time, how much skills, how much knowledge and training do journalists have on this issue? The confidence to kind of think about these things is, I think, key. Secondly, even in the rush to publish, one deep breath, just, give it a moment. And a moment can be 5 seconds, which of course is a lot, as you know, in a 24-hour news cycle. It might be only 2 seconds, but give it a moment. So not just, here we go. And then, if there is some kind of, in the newsroom, and again, it doesn't have to be like big long seminars or anything like that, but just occasionally these things are being discussed in the editorial session. Somebody brings somebody in from, say, a minority group that has been persecuted. You have a discussion with that. That, I think, is like where you reach out to different communities that have been victims of those kinds of coverage and come and share their point of view and their experience. That can go a long way. And then it does, and one of the reasons why we always engage with editors and press councils on these things, it's quite important that the leadership in the media takes it seriously. You can do training courses till the cows come home with journalists, and they'll be really motivated and so on. But if they come back to a newsroom in which this is even seen as, I don't know, lovey-dovey, flowery skirt, don't do it, what are they going to do? So you need to get the editors, the decision makers in media, to buy into this. And as you know, in most cases, this means you have to get them to buy into this and to understand that not only is it the right thing to do, it is actually the smart thing to do for your media company over time. It might get you, sensationalist sales, if that's, or advertising time or whatever, right now. But over time, very often that doesn't work. So, a certain amount of balance is better, I would think. And you can even see it, with, the perfect example of how bias does work, which is Fox News, which works really well on this. But they had a really, really good run for the longest time with this, you will get right-wing stuff from us. Not hate speech, but, pretty certain way of looking at the world. But they're not as successful anymore as they used to be, so people do get tired of it. So I think that's quite important. Codes of ethics, in a way, kind of describe the aspirations of the profession. So how we should behave. And so they're not laws, but, press councils have codes of ethics, journalist organizations have codes of ethics, and media companies have codes of ethics. And in some cases, there are some types of sanctions involved if you break the code of ethics. It could be a fine for a media company. It could be that you have to publish a retraction. It could be that you're just named and shamed in some publication of the press council. So they do have a value, and most of them all deal with, say, avoid discrimination. So they do address this. But I think what's important is it's not necessarily, we don't need another code. There's lots of them. What we need is how do you make the shift from these aspirations to, okay, what does that actually mean for me in the newsroom? And this is what I meant when they're saying that if there's kind of some type of discussion in the newsroom, if the editors are involved in this, if the press councils actively come out and say, we think this is an issue, not just say there's a problem and list all the ones that are doing badly, but also list some of the ones that are doing well, and say, look, if you want an accurate portrayal of the society that we live in, it does need to look at all of these different groups, and kind of call on editors to become involved in that. That I think is helpful, and you can use civil society organizations that engage with media organizations themselves, training institutions, etc., to try and push this. Certainly better than the law, I would think.
Would you like to say anything about how journalists who become victims of hate speech, trolling online, etc., how can they respond?
Yeah, as we all know, the trolling, the Twitter attacks and so on, individuals that have been subject of that, it's quite a traumatic experience. I think journalists, to some extent, if they are part of a newsroom, if you're freelance, it's already a different story because you're on your own most of the time. If you're part of a newsroom, if you're part of the journalistic profession, there's a certain level of protection there. And journalists, over time, the world over, have been subject of attacks. And, from powerful people most of the time. So I think for them, if they are part of, some kind of support network from their colleagues, that's crucial. Because, as you know, the best way to deal with these things is to ignore it, because you can't engage at that level. As a journalist, of course, you are in the privileged position in comparison to an individual normal person, inverted commas, is that you're part of a media organization. So if you feel that you have something to say on this, you got a big platform to say it, bigger than the individual Twitter guys in the end. Because as you know, one of the issues with social media, of course, is that most of the time, and this I think is where media organizations and journalists should take a breath, they become, self-perpetuating. So I say something stupid and outrageous to my followers, who are also all stupid and outrageous. They say it to theirs, etc., etc. We reach about, once you hit the 200,000 mark, there's normally some mainstream media company that picks this up, who goes through what's trending on Twitter. And then it goes on to their, just if it's just a line on the website or below, or what's trending on Twitter kind of thing. And of course, the moment there, it reaches a much larger audience with a bunch of Twitter users again who are tweeting it to their followers, and boom, there you are, and you get 2 million or whatever. And then suddenly this looks like this is something that is also important, and it really isn't. It starts with something quite small, and that I think this is what I meant when I said just because somebody says something outrageous and stupid. That's even if say this person is a celebrity, which is normally how this starts. You might want to look at it and say, well, is this really relevant? And if it's just somebody, it's even less relevant, because that's the question of who is the person and what is the reach, as they say, of their speech. If the reach of their speech is, even if it's 10,000 Twitter followers, which is a lot, and as we know in the Chinese context, is nothing. If you don't have 1 million Twitter followers, you're nobody. Yeah? So it's. I think sometimes these things are, because as we all learn to live with these different ways of expression, sometimes these things tend to get overboard. And I think it is important to basically make sometimes a courageous judgment and say, this isn't really news. And that is actually something, again, where it gets back to your standards, your confidence, your general skills and knowledge of the profession and news, making decisions, trying to define what is news and what isn't. And of course, sometimes, as we know, the famous man bites dog, if it's a bit out of the ordinary, it's more news than dog bites man. And very smart, people with extremist messages know this, and of course go over the top, because they know if it's, Islamic State, horrible videos, it gets picked up. And I think, obviously it gets picked up because there's a war going on in which these people are involved, so yes, it must be reported. If it is just a bunch of loons with those kinds of crazy videos, which I'm sure there are many of those out there, it shouldn't be reported, because it's not the reach, it's not the same thing, or it's reported within the context of a general malaise or problem in society. I think that's really what the issue is here. And I do think that, especially when you're dealing with, as unfortunately we tend to do so much now, the persecution of religious minorities. I mean, one of the examples just of recent days with the Yazidis in Iraq. I mean, I've read in several newspapers they are a Christian sect. They are not. They predate all the Abrahamic religions. And it's that kind of, we think, journalists, I hate to say this, can be lazy. And sometimes it's like, you read a half a line and it gets us, but this is then what informs people. And it is then sometimes worth it. If you say, all right, we're a quality news organization and we're proud of it, then you do need to make that effort. And you do, if you're a media owner or an editor, you do need to make that investment into that quality, because that is, as you cut jobs, if people have ever less time monitoring 15 Twitter feeds and running after all kinds of things in a 24-hour news cycle, something will get missed. And you make mistakes. And that's fine too. That's part of journalism. Here today, gone tomorrow. But you need to be aware of what the potential impact of your mistakes can be. And as I was saying, maybe to finish off, as you're having this conference here there in Kathmandu, there's this conference of the UN Alliance of Civilizations that deals with a whole host of issues, but one of them is hate speech. It's, I think, quite important conferences like the one that you're organizing and like what we're trying to do with the Bali Media Forum, where the professionals, the civil society groups, the people who are actually dealing with these things, do it themselves and can say to politicians, UN institutions, no, we're not completely disregarding this problem. We may not have all the answers. No, we're certainly not perfect, but we are addressing this. Because if it is addressed within an international legal environment, my concern would be that it would limit freedom of expression and not necessarily really help confronting hate speech. You have more examples of blasphemy laws being used to restrict freedom of behavior and of speech of individuals than you have examples of blasphemy laws actually really protecting religious minorities. So hardly ever, because if they ever use, it's normally the religious majority that uses them. So I think that's a very good example of where it actually doesn't help.